This is for the 10th anniversary of the JoMama Book Club. Jonathan's the Jo, and I'm the Mama. We founded this club in November 2007, so we'd have time together and a guaranteed book discussion every month. And Jonathan kindly incorporated Mama instead of Mom, which is what he really calls me. This is very important background information. Apparently, I was misquoting Jonathan to friends when I was telling them about his diplomatic manner when he was only 9 years old and was trying a new dish I'd made him. I said, "I made a new dish tonight, Jonathan. I think you'll really like it." And he took a bite and then put his fork down and said, "It's delicious, Mama, but I don't think I'm quite the one to like it." Jonathan heard me telling this story and he said, "I don't call you Mama. I call you Mom." I think I know how I made this mistake, and it comes from a Broadway musical, which is what I spent my childhood and adolescence listening to instead of reading books. But that's another story. Jonathan was willing to incorporate my misquote of him into the name of our book club because that way it would have 3 syllables and sound more Italian, like the Jonani duo, which my son and my mother had formed around 1995 with Jonathan on the clarinet and his Nani on the piano. They'd get together every 6 weeks or so, and after playing Scrabble and having dinner, they'd practice for one of the 2 concerts they gave our family every year, a 10-minute concert on his birthday in March and a 10-minute concert on her birthday in October. Ours would be the JoMama Book Club, meeting every month for 3 hours, and maybe it would help my son and me feel a little bit less the loss of the Jonani duo, which in 2007 was performing fewer concerts for the family because even though my mother could still play the piano, something was filling her with anxiety over their performances, and as it turned out, their last time playing together was in 2011 in the memory loss section of Aegis, the summer before she died. So Jonathan and I began our discussion in San Francisco with Jonathan's suggestion, Canasta, a book of short stories by William Trevor. Then when Jonathan moved to New York City, we continued to meet monthly online in the form of written chats that lasted 3 hours and printed out into 15 to 25 pages each. We've kept that tradition, and now I have 9 binders of our discussions, which are often like a personal diary, because when we start our chat, we talk about both what we've been doing and how what we've read connects to our lives or doesn't. Tomorrow, for our 10th anniversary of the JoMama Book Club, we'll be discussing Henry Marsh's Admissions and Do No Harm. Who but my beloved son, who works at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, could get me to read a book about a neurosurgeon who operates on brain tumors and describes pulling a woman's scalp off her forehead and folding it over her face. But I feel I've gained by reading books he recommends, books that I probably wouldn't read if it weren't for my son and the other half of the JoMama Book Club. Another example is Emperor of Maladies, a biography of cancer by Siddhartha Mukherjee, which turned out to be a really good book too. And I followed it up by going to a reading the author gave and asking him about Wit, the play about a professor of literature specializing in Donne, who understood the importance of the semicolon and finally understood the importance of grace, my recommendation. But there are some books that were naturals for the JoMama Book Club, like Will Schwalbe's The End of Your Life Book Club, and later his Books for Living. He later spoke at Memorial Sloan Kettering on the East Coast, as well as Bookshop West Portal within walking distance of my home. Another favorite among the books we've read in the JoMama Book Club is Anne Fadiman's Ex Libris, also about books and a love of reading. We'd already read her book, The Spirit Catches You and You Fall Down. Here she is at Bookshop West Portal promoting her book about her father and his love of wine. When I reflect on the JoMama Book Club, I also see personal history. My nephew Carl Langner was just beginning his medical studies in San Francisco, and Jonathan was working at UC Berkeley, also in the health profession, when we met in March 2008 over breakfast at the Seabreeze Cafe in San Francisco, where we discussed Wild Cheap Chase by Haruki Murakami. Jonathan and I also met a couple of weeks after the death of his dad, my first husband, Robert Wills, who was a bibliophile like us. And we got together at a restaurant near where Robert had once lived. And we also had Robert's favorite cheese while we remembered him and also discussed our book of the month, Eileen Chang's Lust, Caution. I told Jonathan about a time when I gave his dad lots of books for Christmas, and his dad gave me a lot of books. And then we went to a beautiful cabin in Yosemite, and I read the books I'd given him, and he read the books he'd given me. This was a reversal of the gift of the Magi. In January 2011, after we returned from a City College course tour of Vietnam, we read Graham Greene's The Quiet American, and later that year, when my mother had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's, we read Lisa Genova's Still Alice. Then after my mother's death, we read A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, because it was one of my mother's favorite books when she was a young woman. We've put to good use the wall-to-wall bookshelves Jeff Zanetto built in 2012, although a couple of our books of the month haven't quite fit on the section I've cordoned off for the JoMama Book Club. Jenny Goodman's very well-written thesis and Hamilton Tome are two of those that don't fit, maybe the only two. And we've had a lot of stimulating discussions, stimulating to the point of a nervous breakdown. Actually, I'm just imitating the cover of Someday This Pain Will Be Useful to You. We've usually been awake during our discussions in San Francisco and in New York when we've talked about the books face to face. But most of our discussions have been online, where I have a view of my garden to the east and a view of Jonathan and my written discussion on the computer to the south. Here's what a printout looks like. I usually read this discussion we've had the following morning because they're pieces I missed since we're both typing at the same time. Here we were discussing some of David Hathawel's poems, as well as No Good Men Among the Living, and we had already read Hologram for the King by Dave Eggers, so we were interested in an article about that. Here you have Survival in Paradise by Manfred Wolff, Skidoo by Alex Kapu, and Unnecessary Woman, Let's Talk About Love, The Empathy Exams, Tom's River, and here's Jonathan in December 2016 reading from Jerry Nachman's Showstoppers, which got us to watching The Music Man. We read The Sellout in January 2017 after the election and the Women's March. We also read What Do We Do Now after the election, as well as Flirting with French and The Cheese Trap. Here's a collage I made in 2015 explaining that the JoMama Book Club isn't as precious as the name sounds, but it is precious. I've heard laments about book clubs that people don't read the books, that people hardly discuss them at all, that people drop out. But our discussions are always stimulating. Forget those pictures of Jonathan sleeping. And our book club of two is still going strong. We always go back to particular passages that make an impression, sometimes going through the books chapter by chapter, scene by scene, or in the case of poems like those of David Hathawel, phrase by phrase. I have to admit that right now, as I finish this, it's closer to Mother's Day 2018 than it is to November 2017 when I began this talkie. I call this a talkie because it's so low-tech, like something from the late 1920s, early 1930s, but that's okay. On Mother's Day, I'm grateful that I have a son who's a bibliophile like his parents and whose insights always add something major to our book discussions. So thank you for making this and every Mother's Day a happy one, Jonathan. And happy 10th anniversary of the JoMama Book Club, now 5 months into its 11th year.